Another index, which is quite revealing, you just didn't hear about last month. The non-aligned countries had two, which represent, they account for about 80% of the population of the world. This is not a small group. They had two major meetings, one in Havana and one in Cartagena in Colombia, in which they came out with quite important statements, which were not published here. In fact, the Colombia meeting wasn't even mentioned. I had a friend do a database search on it. They came out with a strong condemnation of the neoliberal programs that are forcing them into poverty and suffering throughout the world. They came out very strongly against any form of sanctions, unilateral sanctions, and they strongly condemned what they called so-called humanitarian intervention, which is just a cloak for traditional imperialism, in which the old imperial powers do what they feel like under a cloak of righteous moralism. Well, that's not the kind of thing you want to have on the front pages, so since it's only 80% of the world, we can forget about it. It wasn't reported. Well, that's part of what happened when the space for non-alignment disappeared. The interests of the South can be forgotten. They're of no concern anymore. Not that they were ever much concern, but you had to worry about them when there were two superpowers around. In the 1960s, the non-aligned countries were strong enough to issue a call for what they called a new international economic order, a form of globalization, in other words, a form of globalization that would, as they described it, respond to the concerns and the needs of the overwhelming majority of the people of the world. And in fact, the United Nations, that initiative, instituted its main economic planning and development unit, UNCTAD, UN Commission on Trade and Development, which technically still exists, but it's gone the way of every part of the United Nations that caters to some extent to the interests of the South, been essentially close to eliminated. It was formed in 1964 to develop programs for a form of international integration, what we call globalization, that would cater to the interests of most of the population of the world. Well, that wasn't going to go anywhere. A kind of globalization was instituted in the 1970s, but following a very different course and responding to very different interests. That's what's called globalization in the West. It's a form of international integration which has at most incidental concern for 80% of the population of the world and has great concern for private corporate power and elite elements that are connected to it. That's what we call globalization. One part of globalization was a program to stabilize commodity prices. Now, for third world countries, for the countries of the South, which are mostly primary producers, that's extremely important. If commodity prices oscillate wildly, take coffee, which is the second major commodity in world trade after oil. If the price, and for Colombia, a huge product. If coffee prices go up and down very sharply, it doesn't affect agribusiness very much. So if you're a big agribusiness company, you can take a loss 1 year in your coffee production and make it up somewhere else. But suppose you're a small producer, suppose you're a peasant producer. You can't tell your children, don't bother eating next year, maybe there'll be some food the year after. That doesn't work. So if commodity prices oscillate wildly, it drives poor producers out of coffee production or other primary production. Notice that the stabilization programs are not at all unusual. Every rich country has them. The United States, for example, has massive programs of subsidy to mostly agribusiness to keep prices more or less stable within some range. It just reached a record last year of $25 billion, going up even higher this year. Same with the European Union, same with Canada. Every rich, powerful country has programs like this. But there's a kind of a law of economic history, which not many people are taught in economics courses, which is that economic development and growth depends very heavily on the massive state sector, which violates market principles, but in a very carefully calculated direction. It provides support for the rich and powerful, but those devices are not available to the great mass of the population, to the poor. They're not allowed to have them. And this was a case in point. So commodity stabilization programs paid for by taxpayers are fine for, say, agribusiness in the West, but they're not permitted for poor producers in the South. So the UNCTAD program to stabilize commodity prices was destroyed with the immediate and understood consequence that it would drive poor people to produce something for which there is a stable market. And there is one. It's called coca, poppy, marijuana. So they're driven to that by these policies. That's gotten a lot worse in the last 10 or 20 years under what's called globalization, the neoliberal policies. Countries of the South, most of the world, are compelled to accept what are called rational economic programs, which means to open up their borders to imports from the rich countries. So to open the borders to highly subsidized agribusiness exports, which will, of course, wipe out their agricultural systems. That's happening all over the world, from Mexico down to the south of Latin America to Africa and so on. So you open your borders under what's ludicrously called free trade to imports from highly subsidized Western agribusiness. And then the peasants who are driven out of production as a result of this rationality are taught by people who studied at Harvard and places like that. They're taught that they're supposed to be what are called rational peasants. There's a whole theory of rational peasants. Rational peasants produce for agro-export, not for the local markets, and they have to maximize profit. That makes you a rational peasant. Well, if you're in Bolivia or Colombia or some such place and you want to be a rational peasant, there's exactly one way to do it, namely produce drugs, coca. And if you learn your lessons and you really are a rational peasant, you're rewarded. You're rewarded by chemical and biological warfare, by military gunships to kill your children and so on. That's the system under which we're now living. Being a rational peasant is part of accepting the logic of globalization that you hear great praise for. If you read Thomas Friedman and other cheerleaders and so on. Well, that's the rest of the story. And it's in that framework that drug production proceeds. There's a way to stop it. For example, you could allow commodity stabilization programs in the third world. You could provide a fraction of the money that's going to kill people could be used to develop alternative crops. The socioeconomic problems in Colombia, which are extremely severe, can be dealt with in several different ways. One way is to try to change the internal structure of the country, to follow programs that would in fact benefit the population instead of oppressing them. That's one way. The other way is to go in and kill them. Well, that's the choice that you have, and you can see very clearly which one is being taken.